Hey there, we're going to talk about plants today, but interestingly enough, the plan is to talk about most of the plants you probably don't think about. So, there are four main large categories of plants. Two of them are seedless, and then two of them have seeds. And the plants you're probably the most familiar with are actually the ones from the angiosperm category, in that they are the ones that have flowers and fruits and are honestly all around us. But these other plants that are a little bit earlier on the evolutionary scale are still very important, and they have some very interesting characteristics that I want to go over. So let's go ahead. All right, we're going to start with mosses. So mosses or bryophytes. So let me give you some of these terms. So mosses, which are also known as bryophytes, are seedless non-vascular plants. So they have photosynthetic plant material, so they're made out of sort of plant stuff, and they have an outside cuticle to hold things together in a structure, but they don't actually have any tissue that can transmit anything. So all the water that they get, they have to be in contact with. The cells have to actually touch. So they are very close to the ground, and they are typically in fairly wet places. They can dry out, but then they simply sort of hibernate until they get wet again. So you've seen dried out mosses. You want to get them wet for them to look nice and lush and green. So here are these lovely green mosses. So one of the really interesting things about mosses or bryophytes, and actually everything in this category, which includes two other plants I'll mention in a moment, is that in the alternation of generations where they go between a diploid, or two chromosomes, and a haploid, one chromosome state, moss are actually the gametophyte generation is in there in the one chromosome state. So the main part of the moss that you see is essentially equivalent to the baby version of other plants, but in this case, it's the dominant form. So if you'll see here, these are some mosses down at the ground. They're probably some of the more common ones you've seen. They have that kind of starry look at the top. You can see sticking out of them are these long stalks. That's actually the sporophyte, and the top of the stalk is the capsule where the spores live. These spores are what is going to grow into the rest of these plants. So this little tiny stalky part of the plant is actually the only part with two chromosomes. It's really interesting. Specifically, and yep, here's another version of it. The tops of these little mosses contain the egg and the sperm, different ones in different plants. And when the rain falls on them, the sperm gets splashed from the tops of the spermy ones, which are the antheridia, to where the eggs are, which is the archegonia. So then the sporophyte forms from the zygote, forms out of that, makes these little capsules with spores, and the spores fall, and you end up with, again, more gametophyte moss, which are actually both male and female versions all right next to each other, and you wouldn't know the difference unless you got very, very close to them to find out. This is sphagnum moss, which is one that you might be commonly familiar with because it grows in sort of peaty areas and marshes and things like that, and we often use it as part of fertilizer because it contains really good organic material. So this is also similar to a bryophyte, but it's not quite a bryophyte. It is a liverwort. So let me put that in a color I think you'll be able to see here. Liverwort. Well, maybe. So the liverworts are just a little bit different than the mosses in that they are flat. So you can see these little flat liverworts, but they're the same thing as in this generation as the haploid one. They have to be very near to the ground, and they don't have vascular tissue. So even though they look like little leaves, they can't actually transmit any water. They don't have any veins in them. Here's another liverwort. So let me go ahead and get to the next slide. You can see another flattened section here. This one is even closer to the ground. Liverworts have the neatest little sporophyte structures. They look like little umbrellas. Isn't that cool? So these little umbrellas here are the sporophytes of the liverwort, and they're dropping the spores that will form back into these. You're probably not going to see very many liverworts around your area, but if you do, you should grab a picture. So the last of this type, so bryophytes, liverworts, and hornworts, which are same thing, still non-vascular, still no seeds, still none of that stuff, and still gametophytes. Only these guys are little pointy versions instead of more leafy versions. But those three are the ones that fall into that category. All right. So now we move to the next group, which still doesn't have seeds, but does have vascular tissues. They're able to pick up water from the ground and take it up to where their leaves are, and you end up with a fern. So now we can pick up the water and move it, but we're still not producing seeds, and we still don't have a way for our sperm to get to our egg, so we still have to live near water. So this is very important that these guys live near the water. So in the last one, the gametophyte was dominant, so mosses and liverworts and bryophytes. Gametophyte is dominant, and the sporophyte is actually attached to the gametophyte, so it is dependent on it. In this case, the sporophyte is dominant, but interestingly enough, as you're going to see in a moment, the gametophyte kind of does its own thing, which is super funky. So these are ferns. Underneath ferns is where they form the spores, so sporophytes form spores. And the spores form the portions that become the male and the female parts. So here's another set. And actually, if you're walking through a place with a whole bunch of ferns in the right points in spring, typically, you'll actually see a lot of them have these little sporophytes under their leaves. When those spores fall, they form these little heart-shaped structures. These are the gametophytes. So this is an independent gametophyte. It lives on its own somewhere underneath the fern. It doesn't get very far usually, but does live there. And then the sperm live down in this section, and actually probably down here. It's a little hard to tell what direction these go, but the sperm live at one end, the egg live at the other end. And they can swim from one to the other, which is why they still need to be near water. These cannot completely dry out or they don't work. They got to stay wet. And then the little fern starts to grow out of the gametophytes. There it is. This is our gametophyte. That's where the egg was. And this is a tiny baby fern starting to grow out of it. Okay, so this is the life cycle that we learn with these parts. But there are other things in the fern category, also known as seedless vascular plants, that have slightly different reproductive cycles and look a little different that you should probably know about. So this is a club moss. You've probably seen similar plants to these. They have these sort of overlapping bristles. So they look a little bit like a moss, but they're much larger than a moss, and they have vascular tissue. So that's the big key thing, that they don't need to be sitting in water. They also make little spores that can fall and do things, but you're less likely to spot them, and they kind of live underneath and inside these pieces. But you should keep an eye out if you have one. So a club moss is in the fern family. Horsetails are another one that falls into this category. They also still produce spores that just fall down, so they don't have any pollen or any seeds or anything like that, so they're similar to ferns, seedless non-vascular. And the last one in this category is a real neat looking plant called Psilotum. So these are Psilotums. That's really most of what you're going to find in this category. There's not a lot of different species, and most of them are ferns in some manner. Okay, so non-vascular, or we started with non-vascular, then we moved to vascular but still seedless. Then we move into, now we have seeds and a way for our sperm to travel that lets us move away from water, but everything is still sort of naked and moved by wind. And that's what gets us to our gymnosperms. So gymnosperms, naked seeds, have pollen and they have seeds. And they're able to use those to travel much, much further away from water. You might also notice that a lot of gymnosperms fall into the conifer family. They also tend to have very, very small leaves, like little pointy leaves and scaly leaves. And that is in big part because they tend to live in places where it is very cold, very icy, very snowy, very extreme temperatures. And they need to maximize the ability to not get stuck under snow and ice, but also get sun. So those big broad leaves do a very poor job of this, because if they get stuck under ice, they fall down and they completely can destroy a tree. But if there was good weather here, these guys would get beat out by things with those leaves. So they mostly survive in these environments because these environments are tough and those little tiny leaves give them what they need to do so. So I said these guys have pollen. If you've never looked really, really carefully at most pine trees of some kind, they've actually got two different kinds of cones. These little tiny cones are the male side, the male cones. They're antheridia, and they have pollen on them, so they're pollen cones. And the large cones are actually the female or ovulate cones. And inside pretty much each of these little pieces that you've got here is an egg. And so the sperm can travel to the egg. And it can do it from the same plant or it can do it from different plants. So these guys are monoecious in most cases, as in they only need one plant to pollinate. So they can self-pollinate. There are three other interesting parts, groups in the gymnosperm category. So we'll go over those as well, because most people know the conifers. But this is an ephedra plant. You might recognize ephedra as a diet drug that used to exist a long, long time ago, because it speeds up your metabolism, and it does that. It actually acts like pseudoephedrine. Is supposed to be similar to this kind of effect of ephedra. It's like an amphetamine. It speeds things up. But it's a neat looking little plant. However, it does form seeds and pollen, therefore it falls into this category. Technically, it is what we would call a gametophyte. Gametophyte. And there's only 3 main species in this category. This is one of them, the ephedra. The Welwitschia here is another one. I am particularly fond of this plant. It's super funky. It's got this big leaves, and it lives in very dry places. And you can see it actually makes these little cones that it can use for reproduction, just like conifers. But when it dries out, interestingly enough, it like withers. And then when you give it water again, it opens back up. They're a lot of fun, Welwitschia. But they're both gametophytes, that and the ephedra, and I think there's one other in that category, but I don't have an image of it. All right, the next one that falls into the gymnosperm category is the cycad. So this is a cycad. It looks not like something you were unfamiliar with, but like maybe a palm tree. But it is technically different, and you can tell because of the cones. So these large cones tell you you're looking at a cycad and not like a date or an acai tree or something like that. So, but it still is the same large bark and long things. And the final thing that I'm going to show you is the last category from the gymnosperms, and it is a ginkgo. Now, ginkgos are specifically interesting because they are dioecious. So I said the last time it was monoecious, which means that the male and female are on the same plant and it can self-pollinate. These guys are actually dioecious, meaning that they need a male tree and a female tree to be able to pollinate. So the male makes these little pollen-containing pieces. The female makes these much larger egg-containing fruits, and when they meet up, when you have both trees in the same place, then you get apparently a really stinky smelling type thing that becomes the seed. So it's still not a fleshy seed. So it's not a fruit in the sense of the angiosperms, but it does do things a little differently. Ginkgos are pretty easy to spot because they have these very particular fan-shaped leaves. There's not that many of them around anymore, and there's only just the one species in this category, but they're cool if you can find them. All right. So those are our 3 main categories, and in this case, the gametophytes, as we talked about them, are pretty much just the sperm and the egg, and they live inside of the larger plant. So the gametophyte is fully dependent on the sporophyte in this instance. Same with the angiosperms. We have another whole video on those because they get very complicated very quickly, but I wanted to go through the mosses, ferns, and gymnosperms all by themselves so you get a sense of some of the different things you might find in those categories.